Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you...
Hey there, welcome to Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, the Guided by Voices podcast, every GBV LP, every 2 weeks. Today we'll be taking a look at 2004's Half Smiles, the Decomposed. But first, all music heard in this podcast is played and owned by Guided by Voices. Any reviews or materials cited are owned by their respective creators, and of course, all hail Jeff Warren's Guided by Voices database located at gbvdb.com. Visit everygbvlp.com to subscribe to future episodes or to listen to past episodes. And write to me if you want at jeff@everygbvlp.com. Now let's get to the show. Hello, well, it's 2004 and another end for Guided by Voices. This is the year where Pollard came as close as he ever did to breaking up GBV for good. While he'd broken up the band back in 1992, that only lasted a few months. And when he broke up the band for a third time in 2014 on the Cool Planet Tour, fans didn't have to wait long. Please be honest, Guided by Voices' 22nd record came out just 2 years later. But going back to 2004, when Bob announced the end of GBV, he seemed to really mean it. This was serious. The band was done. And for almost a decade, it was. In fact, if Pollard hadn't gotten the so-called classic lineup back together for Matador's 21st birthday party in 2010, which then led to more touring and an unexpected explosion of material, including, quite incredibly, 3 records in 1 year, take that, Gerard Costloy, maybe Pollard would have retired the name completely. That would have meant that the record we'll talk about today would have been the final GBV LP. As Stereogum wrote, if Half Smiles the Decomposed had been Guided by Voices' final album, its maturity would have been a fitting swan song. So that would have been it. 15 studio records in 2 decades, along with a dozen other singles, EPs, and compilations. It would have been an amazing legacy with one absolute masterpiece, several classic LPs, and too many good songs to count. But thankfully, this is not where the story ends. As I record this, there have been another 10 GBV records, and Bob also has a kick-ass new band who shows no signs of stopping. So I guess it all worked out. Back in 2004, however, it seemed like a good time to end the band. Pollard had, on so many levels, achieved more than maybe he'd ever dreamed of. They'd toured the world, released tons of records, and he'd been heralded as a genius. As a longtime music fan, he'd seen plenty of bands stick around longer than they should, becoming a parody of their former selves, his beloved Genesis maybe being the perfect example. So bringing GBV to an end made a certain kind of sense. Plus, the rock revival of just a few years prior was already beginning to give way to something else, something very unlike Guided by Voices. The freak folk scene was gaining steam, Electroclash was still hanging around, and new bands like Franz Ferdinand and Arcade Fire were getting lots of attention. Pollard was probably feeling a bit sidelined. The indie rock world of the 90s and most of his contemporaries had all but disappeared. Pollard cited 2 things that led to the end of GBV. He felt that Guided by Voices had run its course creatively, and he was also tired of dealing with the baggage that came with releasing records under the name GBV. I'm doing this to get back to ground zero and challenge myself, Pollard said. Get back in the studio so I can play more guitar and do more things. It got to the point where the band was so good it could pull off anything, and so I've become complacent. And that held true for a year or so. He played guitar on his next 2 solo records, double LP From a Compound Eye and Normal Happiness, both from 2006. But by 2007, just 3 years after Pollard broke up GBV, he was back to having Todd Tobias play all the music on his solo records. And while he did indeed play guitar on smaller solo projects around this time, as well as with new side projects like The Moping Swans, he'd also had side projects alongside GBV for years, so why not just keep GBV and continue with the side projects? I think the reality is that Bob was just tired of it all. He wanted out. As he said at the time, I felt cornered with GBV. I painted myself into a corner and I didn't know how to get out or where to take it. And it wasn't just that he was doubting the musical direction of the band. He was also tired of the expectations that came with releasing something under the name Guided by Voices, saying that it had gotten a bit too analytical. There's too much read into it. There's too much evaluation, too much comparison of this album with the last one. He was also tired of the routine the band had fallen into: record, tour, repeat. The fun thing about doing collaborations is that there's no press or touring obligations, said Pollard, adding, I've made the decision that I'm going to lay back on making public appearances and maybe just tour 1 week per month. The reason for all of this was simple. As Bob put it, I want to try and recapture the mystique of the early days. And even if some people were taken aback by the news that GBV, after 20 years, was breaking up, the split was actually a long time coming. Even during the recording of Isolation Drills, Pollard was telling people, I don't know how much longer Guided by Voices can exist. The catalyst that allowed Bob to finally pull the plug was the record he just made with the band. After I listened to Half Smiles, it had a kind of sad, melancholy, but uplifting feeling to it, and it felt like a fitting wrap-up, and at that point, I made the decision. Matador label head Kosloy said of Pollard's decision, it's a smart move, going out on top. The body of work they'd already created meant that, as Kosloy said, GBV will be regarded as one of the greatest bands of their era. And while that's certainly true, what I find interesting is that many of the contemporary write-ups on the demise of GBV ended on either a positive or bemused note. After all, it's not as if Bob was retiring from music and was never going to release anything again. For example, the Washington Post wrote in 2006 that fans pretty much knew it was only a name that was being retired, but I think that's bullshit. By 2004, Guided by Voices had a pretty stable lineup. True, bassist Tim Tobias had just left. I'll talk about that in a second. But Nate Farley had been working with the band for a decade. Kevin March was one hell of a drummer. And Doug Gillard had proven over and over just how important his contributions were to Pollard's songs and to the band. The fact that both Kevin and Doug are in the current incarnation of the group proved that GBV, at this stage anyway, was hardly going through band members the way Spinal Tap went through drummers. It was a real group. So I see the breaking up of these guys and the retiring of the name as a big deal, and quite frankly, whether it's purely psychological on my part, none of Pollard's solo work connects with me the same way that his GBV stuff does, and of the side projects, only Boston Spaceships comes close. Gerard Kosloy, in the quote I mentioned above, after praising GBV, said that the band will eventually be known as just the first half of Pollard's artistic journey. And yet, so far anyway, that's not really how things have turned out. To this day, despite the fact that Bob's GBV material is just a quarter of what he's released, it's the thing he's best known for. Sure, people like Circus Devils, and some of the smaller side projects have their fans, but nothing can rival the attention, not to mention the love, that anything GBV related receives. And I can see how Bob could come to view that as an albatross around his neck. The producer David O. Selznick, after making the blockbuster Gone with the Wind, was afraid that at all he'd ever be remembered for. He went almost mad trying to top it. He wanted to be remembered for more than just one film. And yet when he died, the headline in the New York Times, the way Selznick had always feared, indeed read, David O. Selznick, 63, producer of Gone with the Wind, dies. It's tough to escape an artistic legacy. Even someone like David Byrne, who's had a pretty good solo career, has never managed to equal or get out from under the shadow of his first group, Talking Heads. And while Stephen Malkmus from Pavement has forged a path on his own away from his first group, assuming the role of Generation X elder statesman, you just know that if Malkmus's solo records went head-to-head with the new Pavement record, people would be much more excited by the Pavement LP. And speaking of Matador, Half Smiles the Decomposed was pretty much the last thing the band, or Pollard, not to mention Toby or anyone else associated with the group, released on the New York-based label. So even though Pollard considered GBV to be the Matador house band, he actually had a pretty short relationship with the company, just about a dozen records if you include his solo LPs. So the breaking apart of GBV also meant severing ties to Matador. Pollard's new creative home, for a few years anyways, would be Merge Records, the North Carolina-based label started by Mac and Laura from Superchunk. Bob released 5 LPs and an EP on Merge. Starting in 2008, Pollard released pretty much everything he did on one of his own labels, Guided by Voices Inc., Rockathon, or Happy Jack Rock Records. 2004 ended up actually being a pretty restrained year for the band. Unlike previous years, there was no flurry of releases from side projects. Instead, there was just the GBV LP we're talking about in this episode and one Robert Pollard solo record. That LP was called Fiction Man, It was a limited release as part of the Fading Captain series, and it came out after Bob had announced that he was ending Guided by Voices, but before the band's final record had come out. It featured songs written by Bob, with GBV producer and Circus Devils mastermind Todd Tobias creating the music. The songs were left over from the previous songwriting sessions that had led to Earthquake Glue, while a lot of the lyrics came from Pollard's literary magazine, Eat. I don't think it's a particularly good record. Yeah, some songs are okay, like Children Come On, It's Only Natural, and Every Word in the World, but too many of the others suffer from the usual tossed-off quality of Pollard's poorest work. Todd Tobias would go on to create with Bob some really amazing solo records, but this one, to me, isn't one of them. The NME seemed to agree, writing, Robert Pollard continues his infuriating habit of writing two different types of songs. Firstly, there are the power pop-shaped chunks of thrift store Beatles magic. And then there are the ones that sound like a field recording of two guys who live under a bridge and drink warm Mary-Down cider out of brown paper bags all day. That being said, the record received its share of good reviews. Pop Matters wrote, the standout tracks on this record for me, believe it or not, are the ballady acoustic ones, adding that they manage to be soft, but they also stay afloat and positive at the same time, without making the listener want to get sick. And website Exclaim wrote, the 14 songs of Fiction Man spotlight the diverse, eclectic side of Pollard that the last few GBV albums have almost all but ignored. Getting back to GBV, as I mentioned before, Tim Tobias had left the group by this time. In fact, he left the band in the middle of the Earthquake Glue tour in 2003. The band still had 6 weeks of dates ahead of them, including almost a month in the UK and Europe. Billboard magazine reported the split, writing cryptically that Tim Tobias has left the band for unexplained reasons. Seeing as how Bob went on to work with his brother Todd for a decade, and Tim continued to play on Circus Devils records, I don't think there was any reason for Tim leaving other than he was just burnt out. He was replaced by Chris Slusarenko for the remainder of the Earthquake Glue dates. Slusarenko then stuck around for the recording of the group's next record. He seems like a super cool and interesting guy. Beyond being a veteran of a bunch of bands, starting with Def Midget before moving on in the early 90s to sub-pop grunge band Sprinkler, they were the first Portland-based band to be signed to the Seattle label. He's also a filmmaker. He even owned a record label for a while, Off Records. They put out some Pollard-related projects, including an album and an EP by The Takeovers, a group he also played in. He's also the owner of a video store in Portland, Oregon. He also, as part of a company named Aika Music, creates original music for film, advertising, and games. And, of course, Slusarenko was also part of Boston Spaceships, along with drummer John Moen. Moen's played with the Decemberists, as a bunch of other bands. He was also part of the Takeovers. Slusarenko and Moen have known each other for years, going back to 1988 when Moen was in the band Dharma Bums. Boston Spaceships put out 5 amazing records between 2008 and 2011. As I said before, of all of Bob's non-GBV work, I consider Boston Spaceships to be his best. Slusarenko continues to make music. He's in a very good band right now called Eyelids. Their most recent record, produced by R.E.M's Peter Buck, who is, of course, a big GBV fan, is called Ore, so be sure to check it out. Slusarenko has said of working with Bob, his songs are just fun to play. Where your fingers end up on the guitar in any given song shows how playful he is in his approach, and I think that's why his songs still sound so full of life. The record was recorded in Ohio at Waterloo Sound. A fan video for the Half Smile song Closets of Henry shows the guys and producer Todd Tobias making the record. It's pretty bittersweet since they all seem happy and engaged. Again, this really did seem like a group. Bob was doing a lot more than just retiring a name. These were real people who had contributed a lot to Guided by Voices. Plus, unlike almost all of his subsequent solo work and even the way GBV works today, Pollard was there with the guys. They were making the record together. The seriousness and melancholy that Pollard had heard in the LP is evident even in the title. Pollard here eschewing his usual whimsical wordplay for something dead serious, namely death. Normally, GBV records are called something like Finalize the Paisley Circus Rainfall or Moose Bucket Triad Jamboree Come Down, but not this one. Even the only other alternate title I could find for this record, Dreaming of Sleeping, is still pretty somber. That's not to say that Half Smiles of the Decomposed is without Pollard's usual charm. The fact that the decaying corpses being referenced are wearing half smiles on what's left of their faces is an acknowledgement by them that their time had come. Whether or not they were complicit in their own death, they're more or less okay with it, the same as Pollard was with the ending of GBV. In fact, the Decomposed people might even be happy about it, grateful even, the title then becoming a wry stand-in for another group who, with their obsessed fan base, GBV was sometimes being compared to. The seriousness of the title is also conveyed in the cover art. Whereas the previous LP featured bright colors and thick orange and pink lettering, the cover to Half Smiles is dark and muted. In fact, in a total contrast to Earthquake Glue, a cover which contained a bright blue sky, the Half Smiles cover is all about night. There's even a sliver of moon in the upper left corner. This metaphor plays out on the back as well, since it features a photo of what is presumably sunset. The cover's collage also hints at the state of GBV, since it features a charred remnant, a bit of incinerated paper. Bob, after 15 records, was feeling burned out and just needed a rest. And then there's the title of the collage, Ashes to Ashes. That's a reference to the English burial service, which is itself derived from the Bible, specifically Genesis 3:19. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Bob wasn't just killing GBV, he was also burying it. You can't get more final than that. It all adds up to one of the best GBV packages ever, a perfect representation of the sound found within and a truly fitting sleeve. The reviews for Half Smiles were almost uniformly positive. Rolling Stone gave the record a 3.5-star review, writing that it's packed to bursting with sometimes inscrutable pleasures, melodies with the whiff of half-remembered classics, misbegotten home taping experiments, and arrangements that appear to collapse before resolving in brave choruses. Pitchfork gave the record a 7 out of 10, noting that it had a pocket full of bright spots, but that it was also filled with mediocre filler, writing that slow, limp songs like Window of My World and Tour Guide at the Winston Churchill Memorial can't come close to even the outtakes suitcase of the outtakes, King Shit and the Golden Boys, from the band's classic lineup. This shows the peril that Pollard was talking about. Not only were his new songs getting compared to the classics on LPs like B1000, but even obscure compilations and anthologies were getting referenced. Bob had wanted to flood the market with product, and it was coming back to bite him. A number of the reviews also took the opportunity to give GBV a valedictory lap around the indie rock racetrack. For example, Drowned in Sound finished their review by writing, "So ladies and gentlemen, grab a bottle of Miller Lite and let's drink a toast to Robert Pollard and his merry band of voices. The fading captain has left the building and, my God, he left it with style." The NME declared that Half Smiles was the best Guided by Voices album yet and assured their readers that there will never be another band like them. The Toronto Sun wrote that Half Smiles was full of sweet melodies, elliptical introspective lyrics, and Pollard's compelling voice, proclaiming the record to be an almost perfect epitaph. Bob's breaking up the band also meant that the tour for the record, since fans knew it would be the group's last, took on an even more celebratory tone than usual. GBV shows are pretty much always a loud, drunken mess, but their farewell tour, dubbed The Electrifying Conclusion, a phrase which appears in the song Murder Charge off of Same Place the Fly Got Smashed, took things to a whole other level. And when it came to the final show, just to amp up the epic factor a notch, it took place on New Year's Eve in Chicago at the Metro. After Tobin Sprout opened the show, GBV proceeded to play 63 songs over an amazing 4-hour set. They also brought on a few guests and longtime associates such as Don Thrasher, Greg Demos, Jim McPherson, and Toby, who joined Bob for 14 Cheerleader Cold Front. Pitchfork wrote of the show, "The farewell was beautiful, a little sad, and incredibly appropriate. A symbolically fitting close to another year and one band's monumental career." For all of us who weren't at the show, in November of 2005, a DVD came out featuring the entire uncut concert. And while Taxi Driver director Martin Scorsese might have filmed and directed the final show by the band for his brilliant film The Last Waltz, GBV had, well, a different plan. They initially hired some college kids to film and edit the show, only, as eventual editor Kevin McCullough states, things were not going as planned. So Rich Turiel, GBV's tour manager, asked McCullough, a professional editor, to take over. McCullough, a fan of the band who'd been at the show, leaped at the chance and even did the job for free. "This was my opportunity to work on a video for my favorite band of all time," said McCullough. "It was like a dream come true. I told him to waive my fee, just tell Bob Pollard to keep making records forever." But that was all after the record had come out. So now let's get back to Half Smiles, the Decomposed, and look at what was meant to be the final GBV LP, song by song. The record starts with, "Everybody thinks I'm a rain cloud when I'm not looking." The song starts by fading in, which is rare for GBV. It matches the last song on the record, which fades out. The lyrics paint a pretty sad picture, with Bob acknowledging that perhaps the best days of the band were behind them. He writes, "'Cause this is not my day, and nobody really cares anymore anyhow, and nobody called again." The band who, 10 years before, was everywhere now couldn't get anyone to really care about them. Of course, GBV even then had a hardcore following, but it was never enough to take Pollard to that next level, something which was abundantly clear to him by this point. And even though Pollard's hungover as usual, he's also hungry to fix things. Then again, having just been called lazy in the previous verse, he admits to wanting a miracle cure for his sorrow. Musically, it's just great. It's a really fun song and a great way to open the record. Pollard put this song at number 10 when ranking his favorite GBV songs of all time for Spin magazine in 2004. Second song is Sleepover Jack.
It hurts me, mind you, in the dark. Come outside and play the spark. Ragged enzyme really shows. Half smells of decomposed, I know.
This is a weird track, with its seesaw bass line and weird voices in the background, which sounds like a more demented version of Yellow Submarine. This sounds a lot more like a Circus Devils song than a GBV song. The only interesting thing to me about the song is that the name of the record makes an appearance, Pollard writing, "Ragged Enzyme Horror Shows, Half Smiles at the Decomposed." The third song is Girls of Wild Strawberries. This song is absolutely gorgeous and has to be a contender for the best track on the record. Bob's said the lyrics don't really mean anything, but that he was inspired to write it after seeing the 1957 Ingmar Bergman film Wild Strawberries. Pollard thought that the women in the movie were striking, and that led him to write this song. The film, which was also written by Bergman, is considered to be one of his best. Derek Malcolm in The Guardian wrote that the film's theme is how life can become atrophied and sterile. I would argue that that's what Pollard was feeling about the band at the time, and so that was probably another connection he felt with the film. At any rate, it's just a wonderful song. The only bad thing about the GBV Best Of coming out the year before is that this track wasn't on it. Also, on the Electrifying Conclusion DVD, there's some great footage of Pollard recording demos of this song and Window of My World. You can also find this footage on YouTube, so check it out. The next song is Gonna Never Have to Die. This is the shortest song on the record at 2 minutes and 18 seconds. It's a fun song, ending with a long acoustic guitar solo. According to GBV insider Rich Turiel, the solo that Gillard plays in the song is pretty much the same as the one Bob played in the initial demo that he gave to the band. Next up is Window of My World.
In the window of my world, I see the sunlight, I see the moonlight crashing through my world. Yeah, in the window of my world, I pry a mystery, protecting my misery. In the window of my world, in my world.
This is another absolutely gorgeous song that shows just how much Bob had grown as a songwriter. It starts off as one of Bob's lightest and, for lack of a better word, prettiest songs. As he said of this track, "I'm not opposed to writing ballads like this as long as they're interesting and not obvious." He goes on to add, "Lyrically, I don't think it's saying anything. It's just like, here's what I see. Here's my world, man, and welcome to it." I actually think that there's a lot more to it than that. First of all, the metaphor for everyone's world having a window is really great, if not totally original. After all, the somewhat similar phrase, "the eyes are the window to the soul," goes all the way back to the Bible. And people have long said that when they share in an experience or learn something about a person, that they're getting a window into someone else's world. It provides a peek at what that person's existence is like. But what I find interesting about Pollard's take on this idea is that he's actually outside himself. He's not looking out through his window. He's removed from himself, looking in, like in an out-of-body experience. After all, he doesn't need a window to know what he's feeling or seeing. He's the one it's happening to. Instead, the song is detached and analytical, going back to the self-examining "I am a scientist." He writes, "In the window of my world, I see the sunlight. I see the moonlight crashing through my world." He's detached and seeing what it is he presents to the world, because of course any window, no matter how big, is going to conceal something. There's always a whole lot of ourselves that gets hidden from view. Speaking of, something once blocked Pollard's view into himself. He writes, "A wall once blocked my view, and I couldn't move it, got bruises to prove it, and maybe I was hurt." Since we know from, well, songs like this, that Bob uses music to be that window through which he sees himself, I think this refers to all those challenges that used to be thrown up between him and his songwriting. Teaching, worrying about making a living, the disapproval of his parents. All of that stuff kept him from doing what he really loved. He couldn't see clearly. It was like a fog, and he was the thing that was lost inside it. After two opening verses, the song then switches to a bridge or a chorus or whatever. It sounds very early 60s before returning at the end to the acoustic guitar found at the beginning. Pollard writes, "In the window of my world, a heart's birth gives me meaning, kicking and screaming." I take this to be a reference to Pollard's two kids. Their lives have given his life meaning. The song ends with Bob feeling bold and crashing through every world in my world. He's not content to merely sit and watch his life. He's going to participate. The fact that Pitchfork called this song limp speaks to the expectations that GBV was always going to held against. Bob was right. He'd sort of painted himself into a corner. GBV was meant to be this heavy party band, and that doesn't leave room for a really nice and beautiful song like this. Again, the DVD of the electrifying conclusion has Pollard playing an all-acoustic version of this song. There was also a Muzak version which was used as the soundtrack to a slideshow of photographs that was played before concerts on the band's final tour. The next song is "The Closets of Henry." This is a really great song that starts off slow, but soon turns into a full-blown rocker. Since the lyrics name-check Charlemagne and make mention of an old king's secret files, I think the Henry of the title could be any one of the 8 King Henrys who reigned in England between the 12th and 16th centuries. Second to last song on side 1 is "Tour Guide at the Winston Churchill Memorial." Now, there's not actually a Winston Churchill Memorial. However, there is indeed a Winston Churchill Museum. It's associated with Westminster College, which is located in Fulton, Missouri. It was established in the 1960s and is housed beneath a church that dates from 1677. The church was reconstructed stone by stone from its original location in London. The fact that it had been badly damaged during the London Blitz makes it the perfect site for a Churchill museum, since he was the British Prime Minister from 1940 to 1945, helping to see London and the Allied powers to victory in World War II. Churchill's not buried there, though. He was laid to rest in 1965 just inside Westminster Abbey. The Winston Churchill Museum is open daily and is available for group tours, which is when you're probably liable to have a tour guide. In fact, Pollard's second wife, Sarah, worked there as a guide right around the time she met Bob, which was in 2003 when GBV played a show in Missouri. This would fit the narrative of the song, since it seems to be about having a crush on, well, a tour guide at the Winston Churchill Museum. As she gives the tour, extending her knowledge, the song's protagonist fantasizes about spending the rest of his life with her. Pollard, once again showing what a witty lyricist he is, says that the efficient female tour guide is on top of things, while Bob then invites her to get on top of him. Pollard describes memorials like the one that's being visited as places that tremble and wish. They shudder to remember the horrors committed and the acts they commemorate, but they simultaneously wish that their existence serves as a record and reminder so that such acts never happen again. If you've ever been to something like that National Holocaust Museum, you know what an apt description this is. And these places do their job, sort of, Pollard writing with a shrug, so I guess some truth belongs to us. Just because you educate people about the horrors of something, that doesn't mean that people won't repeat or improve upon those very same horrors. As a former teacher, he knew that all too well. He's also smart enough to know that even when touring a museum dedicated to defeating evil and eradicating the worst of human nature, it's easy to be distracted by an attractive woman leading the tour. That's human nature too. The song's lyrics contain an additional reference to World War II, Pollard writing, "The longest day dying now." June 6, 1944, the day the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy, and a military operation that's come to be known as D-Day has also come to be known as the longest day. There was both a D-Day book and movie named that, the latter being a huge Hollywood production featuring dozens of big stars like John Wayne, Henry Fonda, and Sean Connery. The film came out in 1962, so Pollard probably saw it over the years on TV. The line in the song, "The longest day dying now," could be seen as a plea for remembrance, for people to not forget about the sacrifices that were made on that horrible day. People, and even history, can have short attention spans, which is exactly why places like the Winston Churchill Museum exist, to remind us and warn against repeating in the future the mistakes of the past. The line might also be a reference to baby boomers, the so-called greatest generation, who, by 2004, were beginning to die out. Musically speaking, this is an absolutely gorgeous song with some really great jangly guitar. It can almost be a Smith song, except that Morrissey despises Churchill. It's just an all-around great example of mid-period, mature GBV. And by the way, I think Pollard would have liked Churchill, since Churchill once said, "All I can say is that I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." Last song on side 1 is Asia Minor.
Slowly as the January snow, miles from everywhere we should know. The portrait laid in life, hate to lie.
At under 2.5 minutes, this is one of the shortest songs on the record. In fact, it takes about a minute before the drums even kick in. So this feels, to me anyway, like one of the least interesting songs on the album. The title of the song refers to the peninsula that used to be known as Anatolia. It now makes up the Asian part of Turkey. First song on side 2 is Sons of Apollo.
And just when it appears there's going to be a successful campaign against smut, just when the Supreme Court seems to be ruling against pornographers, when it appears the nation's returning to old-fashioned moral standards, suddenly the floodgates are going to swing open.
The song starts with a martial beat, electric guitar, and a preacher railing against smut and pornography, saying that Satan is going to vomit filth out of hell. He compares our depraved modern era to Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities that were destroyed by God for being wicked. This is pretty heavy stuff. Where are the elves and the wizards when you need them? But when you keep in mind when this record was made, it makes a bit more sense. In 2004, 9/11 was still fresh in people's minds, and America was at war in Iraq and Afghanistan. George W. Bush, a devout Christian, was president. He called the United States' involvement in the Middle East a war between good and evil. So overblown biblical rhetoric like this was common in both politics and the culture wars. And unfortunately, the garbage spewed in the intro is still being heard today, only in place of old-fashioned moral standards you hear, "Make America Great Again." To paraphrase Bob's favorites, The Who, "Meet the new bullshit, same as the old bullshit." And even though we're all coming of age to a new day, it's a dark new day filled only with running. The dawn that we're waking up to is one we all want to vehemently escape. Pollard, who has long advised us to run wild or motor away, is here giving us something deeply terrifying to escape, our own country. So saying that this was a more mature GBV is an understatement. However, despite the heaviness of this song, a fun thing is that Bob's brother Jim gets a credit in the liner notes for an amp drop. Also, Sons of Apollo is the name of a progressive metal supergroup which formed in 2017, featuring members who have been in such groups as Journey, Dream Theater, Twisted Sister, Alice Cooper, Guns N' Roses, and many others. Their debut record was called Psychotic Symphony. I reached out to the band on their Facebook page to see if this GBV song gave them their name, but so far they haven't responded. Second song on side 2 is Sing for Your Meat.
Dress them up in suits, seek her to kill, freedom of the will, ours and yes, yours.
The original title for this song was Sing for Your Meat, Leon, which is a reference to the Kings of Leon, the band out of Nashville who, at the time, were seen as protégés of the Strokes. They still get a mention in the song. In the first line of the second verse, Bob writing, "Come here, Leon." Pollard had heard that the Kings of Leon weren't playing the game in order to get a bigger audience, and so this was Bob's way of saying, you gotta do it, man. Sing for your meat basically being the same as sing for your supper. Two things are interesting about this. First, that Pollard should admonish another band for not trying harder, since he was a guy who, by his own admission, hated to jump through the music industry hoops and wanted to do the least amount possible in terms of promotion anyway, something he references earlier in the record writing, because they say I'm too lazy. And second, Kings of Leon must have listened because they indeed started to play the game, and in not much time at all, they were much bigger than the Strokes. As an RCA executive put it, if you're a couple of kids from rural Tennessee and your father is a whacked-out preacher and you have this opportunity, well, yeah, you're going to listen. And it's sort of ironic because the Strokes, who were, in a way, protégés of GBV, were the ones who didn't listen. And because of that, Kings of Leon quickly eclipsed them. And maybe that was okay with the band. According to a publicist, Julian Casablancas got what he wanted. He wanted to be the next Guided by Voices. He's really creative, he has all these ideas, but he stops himself or won't play the game to get further. This is something that's been going on in rock and roll since rock and roll began. The line here about the boys being dressed up in suits could just as well apply to the Beatles. The lovable mop tops weren't so lovable when Brian Epstein first saw them playing sweaty lunchtime shows at the Cavern. They looked more like the Ramones than the Beatles, all dressed up in leather. The first thing Epstein did was to get them into matching suits, and the rest is history. But the song also makes an unexpected political statement, Pollard writing, 21 is the legal age to kill yourself slowly, but 18 is the legal age to die. Adding in hunting accidents that, at the age of 18, it's kind of bullshit that you can't drink, but you can go fight in a war. And yeah, some of that is just Bob being Bob. We should all be able to drink tons of Miller Lite. But he's also getting to a very real and fundamental hypocrisy about life in America. He's asking whether we're really as free as we think. Sing for Your Meat also provided the name for a double LP tribute record that came out in 2011. It featured GBV contemporaries such as The Flaming Lips, Elf Power, and Centrido, as well as younger bands like Blitz and Trapper and Cymbals Eat Guitars. And as if to say that all love was not lost between Pollard and the Deal sisters, Kelly Deal, along with Cincinnati band Buffalo Killers, covered Scalding Creek from the Get Out of My Station's 7-inch. Next track is Asphyxiated Circle.
These thoughts replace me when I'm on the floor. I cannot taste the sweetness anymore. You bipolarize me.
The way Pollard sings this song is a lot of fun. It really shows how versatile his voice is, not to mention how adept he is at melody. He really can ring from just about anything a nice tune. The lyrics seem to be a biting condemnation of something trying to suffocate Pollard. It must have been something that was really on his mind at the time, since in another 2 songs, he'll be writing about feeling smothered. In fact, the line in this song, You Write Me Out, I Reappear, recalls B-1000's Smothered in Hugs, where Bob writes of the textbook committee deciding that you should be left out, not even mentioned. But Pollard's not taking any shit, he declares, but I will say what I want to, and there's nothing you can do. The next song is A Second Spurt of Growth.
Exhausted from the last escape, leaving and returning now routinely. And are we changing to the taste?
This is a really nice song that finds Bob sounding more like Paul Simon than Pete Townsend. That is, by the way, no dig at Paul Simon. I love him. Quick aside, I saw him and his kids, along with his wife, Edie Brickell, at a Flaming Lips show in New York City. They seem to be enjoying themselves. The spurt of growth that Pollard's referring to here is, I would guess, emotional growth. Remember what was happening around this time? He'd met his second wife, Sarah Wade, at a GBV show in Missouri the previous year. They'd been married by 2006. His divorce in 2001 was probably still fresh in his mind at the dawn of this new relationship, something he seems to reference in the first line of the song, writing, exhausted from the last escape. And yet now he's in a new relationship, one that finds him leaving and returning now routinely. However, the first chorus strikes a note of fatalism, Bob writing that he can't change the future. This shows Pollard's pessimistic side. It's not just the past that can't be changed. We're not even in control of what hasn't happened. Think back to the characters from Redman and Their Wives, the ones whose existences were issued rather than lived. Bob, who'd struggled for personal freedom all of his life, whether it was from coaches, parents, or his spouse, knew all too well that, as he writes here, people want to keep you down. Their efforts may make you weak, or their attempts to have you remain fixed, meaning static or unchanged, but Bob promises to be stronger. In the episode on isolation drills, I mentioned the Bob Dylan line in You're a Big Girl Now, where he promises, I can change, I swear. And even though Pollard resisted such declarations on that record, here he seems to channel Dylan, writing that, a second spurt of growth will come about me, don't doubt me. It's a pretty positive note. We all, no matter where we are in our lives, have the capacity for growth and for change. Second to last song is Smothering and Coaching.
Go away, they seem so low, they seem so low, make them go away.
This is an interesting song with at least 4 different parts. It's sort of a mini Prague epic, clocking in at just shy of 3.5 minutes. The title alludes to a sort of Freudian slip, the blending mother with smother. Pollard, for a while anyway, didn't have the best relationship with his mom. For years, neither of his parents believed in his dream to make a career out of music, and this left a lasting wound that took years to get over. The song portrays his relationship to his family as pretty dire, writing, You tear your childhood down from the cheekbone. You sell me down when you tell me you'll never spend days unfazed not to tell me I love you. This is a very unsentimental view, ranking right up there with the opening stanza of Philip Larkin's poem This Be the Verse, where he writes, They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had, and add some extra just for you. The reference to coaching in the title is also interesting, the same as when Pollard writes in the song, and they might not be failing solo, and they might not be playing for the team. What team? While he played sports all of his life, Pollard always seemed to resent coaches. Bob then, like now, didn't like to be told what to do. And, of course, coaches are often parental surrogates, especially for fathers. You want to please them. You seek out their praise. You take the field in their name and promise victory. Even Lou Reed, an anti-authority rebel who had plenty of issues with his father, wrote in the song Coney Island Baby, Believe it or not, I wanted to play football for the coach. The last lines of this song seem to be in the voice of the mother, pleading with her child. Baby, don't go. We'll miss you so much. This is your home. Baby, don't go. It's reminiscent of She's Leaving Home from Sgt. Pepper's, the tale of the self-absorbed parents who can't believe that their daughter would choose adventure over her cloistered hometown and their oppressive love. It's an interesting song with a lot going on. Final song is Huffman Prairie Flying Field.
To
GBV's flight and aerial references reached their absolute zenith with this song, named after a famed location just outside of Dayton. Pretty much exactly a century before, in 1904, after the Wright brothers returned to Ohio after their initial flights at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, they needed a place to continue their experiments. A banker named Torrance Huffman came to the rescue, letting the Wright brothers use his pasture rent-free. This became known as the Huffman Prairie Flying Field. The Wright brothers used this location until 1916. Today, it's a national landmark and is part of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The song that Pollard named after this location is absolutely exquisite. The only downside is that some of Bob's vocal is a bit rough. You know that Rick Ocasek wouldn't have let him get away with leaving that take in the final mix. Then again, maybe Pollard felt he was meeting the expectations of his fans who wanted lo-fi, who just expected mistakes. As he writes here, "If that's what you want to feel, then that's what I will sell you." But that kind of second-guessing what his audience wanted is also what led to the band's demise. He needs to throw off the shackles of those expectations, which is why he's referencing this legendary field where the Wright brothers chased their own dreams. Pollard writes, "I've come to start up my head, been closed and locked up for far too long." Guided by Voices had been a band for 20 years, and that was seeming, to Bob anyway, like far too long. An added poignancy to referencing Orville and Wilbur Wright is Bob's relationship with his brother Jim. Whether it's the Wright brothers or the Pollard brothers, it's two guys with a vision and a goal, against the world and sticking together. It's a good feeling to know that each pair of siblings made their mark in history. There couldn't be a more fitting end to the record, especially since it fades out with Pollard repeating for far too long. It's just a really great ending. Really great ending. Really great ending. Really great ending. Okay, that's it for the show. Next time, I'll be looking at LP number 16, 2012's Let's Go Eat the Factory. Not only did it mark the return of GBV after an 8-year absence, but it was also the first album recorded with the so-called classic lineup since Under the Bushes, Under the Stars back in 1996. It proved that you can go to the basement again. Until then, subscribe to the show, leave a review, and God bless the Monument Club.
Diss on the sex list.